Good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here on this rainy and sunny day in Bergen, and so many of you able to attend the Masterclass. Many of you here in the University Aula in Bergen, and many of you also following the stream online. My name is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen, and I'm the Academic Director of the Holberg Prize. Now, the Masterclass that you have turned up to is an event where we work to create a space for exchange and dialogue between the Holberg Prize laureates and PhD students from or in the Nordic countries. Eventually, we would also like to involve the audience in this exchange, so you will have an opportunity to chip in later on, but a bit later on. This morning, we have with us the 2024 Holberg Laureate Achille Mbembe. He is currently Research Professor of History and Politics at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, otherwise known as WISER, University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. He is also the Director of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy. In recommending Professor Mbembe for the prize, the Holberg Committee notes that he is recognized as one of the foremost thinkers of post-colonial Africa and a leading critical theorist of the Planetary. Further, he has significantly advanced the understanding of racism and its effects on subjectivity, particularly through the concept of the racial subject. Mbembe's rejection of all forms of racism is also inspired by the uneven impact of the climate crisis on the global South, a theme explored in his recent work, Brutalism, from 2024. Perhaps relevant for this masterclass, the committee further emphasizes the importance of Mbembe's groundbreaking work, Critique of Black Reason, which came out in English in 2017. This is a philosophical study of the historical emergence and meaning of blackness. It examines how the term black was used to dehumanize individuals in the interests of capital, showing how blackness was associated with being non-human or animal-like, thereby justifying the reproduction of oppressive and exploitative structures. Mbembe argues that some black critics of race have implicitly reproduced the epistemology of racial difference. Recently, Mbembe's focus has shifted to contemporary developments in the colonial imperial world, the nature of late Eurocentrism, the impact of the Anthropocene, and the implications of artificial intelligence for humanity. The committee concludes that Mbembe's oeuvre goes beyond a particularized notion of decolonization to a universalist recentering of the human. This involves a commitment to facing historical truth and fostering learning and remembering across South-North divides. Now, at this masterclass, Achille Mbembe is joined by 5 PhD students, and I will present these very briefly here. Born in Botswana and trained in South Africa, we have with us Maipelo Khabang. She's an artist researcher, educator, and embodied practitioner. Currently, she's a PhD candidate in performative and media-based practices at Stockholm University of the Arts. Her work and practice center on the experiences and knowings of Black women within the Southern African diaspora. So welcome, Maipelo. We are also joined by Signe Søndergaard Moore, who's a PhD candidate with a BA in Theatre and Performance Studies from the Department of Arts and Cultural Studies. This is at the University of Copenhagen. Moore is working on a project entitled American Legacies in Danish Stand-Up Comedy, Intersectional Perspectives on Queer and Racialized Humor. So welcome, Signe.
Thank you.
A third member of our masterclass is Martha Mboka Tveit. She's an independent writer and a PhD candidate at the Department of Cultural Studies and Oriental Languages, University of Oslo. Her work, academic and non-academic, has generally centered on decoloniality and identity, also in relation to climate change and nature, with a cosmopolitan approach to both Nordic and sub-Saharan/African contemporary texts and discourses. Her PhD research takes an eco-critical look at African and Norwegian speculative fiction. Welcome to you also, Marta. We also have with us Apostolos Siovalas. He is a PhD candidate at the Norwegian Center of the Law of the Sea at the University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway. He also works as a research associate at the Arctic Institute, Center for Circumpolar Security Studies, Washington, D.C. Siovalas has a background in polar law and indigenous studies, and his fields of research include international law of the sea, legal pluralism, new materialisms, Arctic indigenous law, and environmental law in the Arctic. Welcome, Apostolos. Last but not least, we have with us Eva Mäkinen. Mäkinen is a PhD candidate in political studies at the University of Lapland. Her research explores the thorny issues of universal political imagination as an affirmative theory of freedom. Her research interests include theoretical perspectives on political freedom and the aesthetics of thought. I think we should give all 4 masterclass participants, as well as Achille Mbembe, a round of applause. Now, this is an event that is in large part in the very able hands of the Holberg Laureate Achille Mbembe and the invited PhD candidates themselves. What will happen now is this. Holberg Laureate Achille Mbembe will first provide us all with an introduction to the theme he has chosen for this masterclass. The theme is no less than thoughts on the planetary. Thereafter, the PhD students will provide a short introduction to their research projects before all engage in a more general discussion of the theme of the masterclass. The discussion will be led by Professor Mbembe. Towards the end of the masterclass, and as promised, we will invite the audience for a more general Q&A session, and I will moderate this part of the event. With this, I would like to give the floor to Achille Mbembe.
Thank you. Thought I should stand up, if only to be able to speak exactly the way I wanted to be. I was smiling throughout Bjorn's introduction because, I mean, bring all of us here in the morning, and then we are sitting here very wisely and getting ready for a performance. We have to look very serious, and as he's telling us about the title of the presentation, I just realized how somewhat grandiloquent it is. It is all planetary thoughts, or thoughts on the planetary, etc. So maybe the first gesture is really to just bring it back to the ground, move from the planetary to the ground. I am absolutely delighted to finally meet the persons with whom we'll be in conversation this morning. It will be more of a conversation than really a masterclass in the true sense of the term. So I'm eager to hear about what Mapelo, what Signe, Marta, Apostolos, and Eva have to share with us. I'm sorry that they have to do it in 5 minutes, but in 5 minutes a lot can be said. Now, look, what is it that personally I have tried to do? I say me, but many others. Africa has been really the center of our preoccupations. In various disciplines, in literature, in theater, in international law, in philosophy, anthropology, history, urban studies, and so forth, and so on. I won't go here into the place Africa has occupied in the general scheme of modern knowledge. That work has been done. Excavation has been done in terms of the paradoxical nature of Africa's position in global formations of knowledge, in the sense that, on the one hand, Africa has been seen usually as that part of the world that has not much to contribute to, let's say, the intellectual journeys of the human on Earth. And yet, in many disciplines, Africa has provided the material, both conceptual, theoretical, without which these modern disciplines wouldn't simply exist. Think, for instance, of the concept of the fetish in Marxist anthropology. There are a number of countless other concepts which, in fact, originated from the continent and are now part of the universal, let's say, matrimony, or for that matter, patrimony. So Africa will play an increasingly central role in the production of knowledge as the century keeps unfolding, and as very important issues of life futures, the sustainability of life on Earth, as these issues take central stage. But Africa is also a repository of countless experiences when it comes to contemporary debates on the body, on embodiment, contemporary debates on identity or forms of identification, debates on sovereignty, as Apostolos will speak to us in a minute. So it's so central that, in fact, one can make the suggestion that, let's say, the African experience might impact very decisively the future of our disciplines, at least as this century unfolds. And it is in that spirit that personally I'm eager to hear about your projects. As Bjorn said, you have 5 minutes, after which we will engage in a conversation I hope will be very convivial, will be joyful, and then we'll invite the audience to contribute to that same conversation. So I would say let's just relax and enjoy the occasion. So thank you very much. If I understand, the floor is now to my fellow, but you don't need to do the grand gesture of coming here. Maybe we can just speak from the arc that we have formed. So it's up to you then.
Okay.
Is it for me?
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Achille. Good morning, everyone. So before I start, as an embodied practitioner, it is very important that I acknowledge the body and all it so tirelessly carries and does for all of us. And I do so by borrowing a practice I picked up from Professor John Paul Zaccarini, where I openly declare my need to manage affect of a dynamic mix of excitement and nervousness that is generated by being in this room today, this morning. I do this so that we are all aware that there are varying levels of functionality, perspectives, and lived experiences present in the bodies that sit here today. And I hope we can go forward with compassion, with that in mind, as the conversation unfolds. With that said, as all compelling research projects in artistic research begin, I will start with an anecdote to help demonstrate the social, cultural, and political influences that have informed the way in which my doctoral research is situated. So, being the only girl child of a female career diplomat, I have had the opportunity to navigate a multitude of cultures and social configurations, mainly in the African and European territories. I was often but implicitly propped up and looked upon as an unofficial, yet inherent representative of my home country and culture during the time living outside of the national borders of Botswana. This unofficial role has somewhat turned into a lifelong internalized posture given my prolonged stay Komahatsing, which is abroad in my beautiful mother tongue. As nourishing as my nomadic upbringing was, it came with its challenges, especially as a growing person living and navigating the world in my particular racialized and gendered body. This was no more apparent where, in my initial research proposal, I speak of when I emigrated to Stockholm, Sweden. I was confronted with a familiar assignment I had been tasked with every time I moved. This assignment was rife with resistance and alienation, which, although inhabited a different social, cultural, and political context, still resonated deeply with my body. This task, which is the title of my doctoral research and has been adapted from the writings of Melissa Harris Perry, is called Finding Upright. Finding Upright became an explicit commitment to having the conversations of orienting and aligning one's identity outside of myself and with other Black women I worked with in and outside of performance spaces, in a period in South Africa that Ndleli, Dlakavu, and Boswell describe as being characterized by significant political, social, and cultural shifts spearheaded by student-led activism, which popularized the hashtag fees must fall, hashtag roads must fall, and RU reference list movements that called for social and economic transformation, as well as the end to sexual violence and rape culture. As a foreign national during that period in South Africa, I was confronted with resistances and alienation that required me to question my sense of identity and belonging, which I like to look at as a form of alignment and orientation in relation to my position within the given context. Since then, Finding Upright has become the practice of identifying navigatory tools and homing devices through an embodied modern African diasporic perspective, whilst being in community with other Southern African Black women within a Western context polluted by sexism, anti-Black racism, and misogynoir. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sine. Could I borrow a pen from someone?
Pens are in high demand.
Thank you so much. This is my bodily intervention. Well, hi. My name is Sine, and yesterday I tuned in for the introduction to this Holberg Week by you, Professor. And you noted how difficult it is to express the direction of the world we live in, or the current state of knowledge, how it circulates, and who it serves. And I am most grateful for this humbling exercise, thinking about the in common and meditating on how to honor the African archive. I am deeply inspired by your work. The concept of necropolitics helped me understand how the making dead of characters and life worlds in theatrical performance can discount and invoke sides of ourselves, fictions and realities, through dramaturgical multiplicity and aesthetic topology. Inquiring how sustainability and power relates to aesthetic production and performance art has helped me formulate the idea for my PhD project, American Legacies in Danish Stand-Up Comedy, Intersectional Perspectives on Queer and Racialized Humor. I have interviewed 30 people working within the comedy industry of Denmark, as well as a disability activist with embodied experience in the lack of accessible venues. And in my project, I attempt to analyze the structural undercurrents and aesthetic reflections within the field of stand-up comedy, since it in Denmark is not unionized and relies mostly on private funding. The individualization of humans as market value and personal narratives as comedy consumption becomes apparent. If all the world's a stage and we understand capitalism as compulsion, then how do the agents within contemporary comedy position themselves when it comes to questions of race, class, gender, sexuality and access, nationality and ethnicity? The common notion of the people I interview is that since the 90s, comedians that are not white, straight, cis men have gained more commercial success. Still, these other stories within stand-up comedy and similar forms of entertainment is to this day underexplored within Danish academia. More comedians are speaking up on the colonialism of Denmark, racial silences and sexism, but they're also the ones who claim that wokeness has gone too far and that freedom of speech must be protected through the right to do harm. It can be hard to connect to the planetary because everyday life can seem so untethered to the social and to the earth, especially so through digital technologies. I'm very interested in how to summon the in common as the third space between communalism and individualism, and if it's possible for my project to commit to the practices of care. Currently, I am preoccupied with the following questions. If laughter is a human commonality, then how do we rethink and redirect the notion of humor and creative freedom within theater, history, and comedy studies to account for other archives, like the ones of the African American Archive of Performance, like the one Schomburg Center, Harlem, queer communities, and communities of disability activists? And how are bodies discounted and disciplined in the mode of the academic performance and our archival practices? And how is this similar to the confining idea of creative freedom within stand-up comedy, like the open mic situation, where singular voices are placed in hierarchical relationship to the audiences? And how do we then account for questions of exclusion, power, timing, and play? As trained improv comedian myself, I have practical experience in the Danish comedy scene. I'm inspired by the idea of the backstage and how spatial and temporal factors are forming which interactions are deemed humorous or harmful, or maybe both. I find that the making invisible of women, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQIA+ people is not exclusively inherent to the stand-up scene. That which goes on within the conversation about humor in these times serves as an important object of arts research, as the working conditions of stand-up comedians and their ability to move between the realms of seriousness and that of joking could be seen as a part of the Earth's vibratorium. Returning to yesterday's challenge about who knowledge serves, I think we could ask the same thing about humor. Who does humor serve? When humor creates social friction in its negotiation of what requires serious inquiry and what you can go more lightheartedly about, I think it's time to ask, what do we care for? Why? And how do we expand our communities of care?
All right. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Hello, I'm Marta. Thank you so much for the honor of having me here today. This is an incredible opportunity for all of us. So mine is more of a little bit of an essay, and it's called The Gift of the Post-Historical Funeral. I got very deep last night, so sorry. So reading Mbembe's brutalism, I imagined a person marching through town in what they think is a procession to celebrate their own triumphant return from a war. A war perhaps to end all wars, a war against nature and against human nature. Now this person marches, crying out feverishly, celebrating the final triumph of the object and of humanity. Yet this person does not realize, but Mbembe enlightens the reader, that this person is in fact marching in their own funeral procession. To paraphrase, we won, but it cost us the earth. But what are the possibilities of a funeral procession? In my work on imagined futures in cultural texts, I'm naturally interested in possibilities. My dissertation takes an eco-critical look at contemporary African and Norwegian speculative fiction. Creators like Masande Ntchanga, Maria Dorothea Stratzenholz, Mame Bogoma Diene, and Tlotlot Samase are in the business of prying open new spaces for the imagination to operate. African speculative fiction, in particular, is marked by adaptability, hope, and big dreams, and changes and themes that go beyond questioning dominant ontologies to questioning the production of ontologies in and of itself, as Professor Quayson discussed yesterday. So I ask again, inspired by such texts, what are the potentialities of this post-historical funeralistic moment? Well, for one thing, I find hope in a theme that runs through Mbembe's later work, energy and its characteristics. The recipient of the Nils Kleems Award spoke eloquently yesterday about the importance of energy social sciences in forging new pathways. Thinking with energy in its broadest meanings and with its finite nature can also offer insights into cultivating the planetary. Energy as circular and finite, constantly converted. Creators are, through living, converted into dead things, and vice versa, dead things are converted into life. All humanity has done, in a sense, throughout the Anthropocene and from the development of large-scale agriculture in the Mesopotamian Peninsula, all the way back to the first use of tools, is actually energy conversion. Converting energy ultimately from the sun into other things. The material point being, humanity never created anything at all. We converted, and we ourselves and our civilizations are converted energy from the sun. The sun has been the spiritual and cultural center point for many an ancient group, civilization, and society. Sun Ra walked around with a big sun symbol on his head when he was gathering African American people for the last Exodus. And I don't think that was random. Through looking towards the sun, one might say we are worshiping our own agency, innovative spirit, and power of converting its energy. But we are also reaffirming the finite nature of energy from our aging star, and thus our own limitations as a species. The material constraints, death, and the finitude of energy can become our solace and salvation at this threshold. Second, endings can be hopeful. I was recently in a panel in relation to the exhibition Corpus Infinitum on Afrofuturism and indigenous futurism, essentially about the hope inherent in the idea of the apocalypse. All indigenous futurism, writes Grace Dillon, is post-apocalyptical, because the apocalypse, the end of the world or worlds, took place with the arrival of the settlers. The world we are living in is post-apocalyptical to her, much as it appears as post-historical in brutalism. Yet in the panel, we discussed how the death card in tarot is often an optimistic card to get. It also symbolizes change and rebirth of some kind, of shedding skin and metamorphosis into a more advanced form. Could the funeral procession, that is our current techno-ecological age, also mark a rebirth? A birth, perhaps, of something none of us can yet imagine, constrained as we are by the trolls guarding the edge of our horizons. Denise Ferreira de Silva challenges us, also through that exhibition, to begin imagining worlds of ethics without value, of difference without separability. In my mind, this translates to building cultures of inclusion without exclusion, categorization, and valuation. Similarly, many of the conversations currently being held about future pathways through decolonization, post-humanism, deracialization, and so forth, seem to be circling around the same question. Can we build culture without exclusion? Can societies, or even small groups, exist over time without categorization and valuation of any kind? Absolutely not, I answered, to the dismay of the audience. But I do think that every single group will, over time and change, veer towards exclusion and valuation, and this is the danger of only holding up relationality as the way forward. It was also an act of Ubuntu when Okonkwo struck down that boy. No one and nothing in no gathering of humans at any point in history is exempt from the politics of exclusion. And this must be our starting point, are we to genuinely move forward. Like Mbembe describes, Blackness as the center of the gravity well of Project Europe, and the unthought at the center of European metaphysics. So exclusion is the black hole at the center of unity and connection, culture and kinship. This sounds bad, but it's actually good. For humanity is also innovative. We are capable of building structures and systems, both large and small scale, that accentuate and limit exclusion and hierarchy and the destructive negative consequences of these. Contemporary technology, AI included, also holds potential here. It is the potential of the beeswax to Odysseus. The beeswax is there on the ship, but we must make the choice to stuff it in everybody's ears, rather than ingesting it because we are full of nonsense and want to hear the sirens sing. Similarly, contemporary technology, accelerating quickly towards a point of singularity, can be used to constrain and protect. Constrain and protect us, attenuating the effects of the human impulse towards interperson exclusion and valuation. We can use our objects and object selves to convert the sun's energy into systems that are better than us and make us better. I'm not saying that that's what we are doing, but we could do it. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. May I proceed next? So first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's my great pleasure to be here, and I've been learning so much through the first three speakers so far, so I really look forward to yours as well. As Björn kindly mentioned at the beginning, I have background in public international law, but I've been working in different issues in a more interdisciplinary context. And the scope of my PhD has been resulting from an overall observed bias that international law of the sea, like any other field of international law, narrates and regulates territory in a way determined by sovereign borders. So sovereignty is the fundamental special unit of international law, and at least since the 16th century onwards has been projecting seawards, drawing lines over the maritime space and enclosing the maritime space into different delineated, striated territories, what we call maritime zones. And for those that you are not familiar with international law of the sea, you may have heard about the territorial sea, the exclusive economic zone, the continental shelf, and so on. So under this understanding, international law of the sea thinks about the ocean space always on the ground, on both borders. Yet, the outset of the 21st century, and probably way earlier before, marked the Kino-scene, a period characterized by ever-increasing mobility across the world's planetary boundaries. And I'm borrowing here the term Kino-scene from a philosopher called Thomas Nile, which uses it as a critical reimagination of the Anthropocene to think of the Anthropocene in light of motion, in light of movement, and in light of transboundary challenges and transboundary contexts. Covering over 70% of the planet's surface, the oceans has been probably the most exposed terrain to such mobility patterns, largely pushed by technological developments, transboundary species, bodies at sea, and so on. So this is well links also to your concept of planetary entanglements when we think about interconnectivity across different planetary strata, but also about power dynamics that they shape these connectivities and they shape these mobilities in space. So in my PhD, I've been doing in that regard both theoretical work and empirical work. Theoretically, thinking with the Kino-scene as a method, I'm trying to encapsulate how does the law of the sea first regulate motion, and subsequently how does the law of the sea understand what does motion mean for the law of the sea. So there's a lot of literature dealing with the first part, which is apparently evident that the law of the sea does not efficiently regulate motion because there's a lot of transboundary challenges in the world's ocean, and this is a fact. However, I would like to focus here more on the onto-epistemological part, and I would like to mention that in my discipline, motion has been one of the less discussed concepts. So in jurisprudence, which is the study of law, of legal theory, motion has been treated as a non-philosophical category, mainly left to physics, to mathematical observations, and the relocation of bodies in space from point A to B. So this locomotion, this is all about motion in international law of the sea. And this is a result from Western modern thought. Before modernity, and I'm Greek, I'm highly interested in pre-modern philosophy as well, motion was something equal to time and space, a complex dimension of the universe, had also non-palpable qualities. It could be culture, identity, and could not fully be comprehended and controlled by the human subject. Modernity, and particularly the Cartesian worldview of motion that subsequently paved the way for Newton's mathematical observations and the study of motion under the physics, basically reduced motion to the relocation of bodies in space and basically excluded every other understanding of motion that was out there in the world. So law echoed this understanding, and I would like to relate with yours because you mentioned that we cannot think of culture without exclusion. This is what modern culture did to any other non-modern culture out there. So subsequently, after pursuing this theoretical unpacking, the genealogy of motion in Western modern thought, I've been engaged with empirical work with Arctic indigenous communities, trying to figure out what motion may denote, may mean beyond the foundations of modernity. I spent a summer of my PhD living with an Inuit family in the northwest part of Greenland and being engaged with traditional hunting and fishing activities in the sea. So this particular community has been living at the edge of Greenland's maritime zone in a place really close proximity to Ellesmere Island of Canada. And since time immemorial, they have been navigating the sea and sea ice continuum on the grounds of customary law without really taking into consideration of borders. So by looking at how motion is reflected in their hunting practices, in their own understanding of law, I have tried to illuminate an Inuit understanding of motion that diverges from this sovereign approach to marine space that we see in international law. And for them, motion is more than human. It's deeply anchored in their identity, in their culture, and intertwines with the animal movement and the weather movement in the seascape without any territorial confinements. So through that study, I've attempted to denaturalize motion, to think about motion in a way that is not natural, as we take it for granted in international law, but also link it to what I call it kinopolitics, which is the politics of movement, and try to think who decides about movement. You mentioned, Achille, yesterday in your presentation how important it is for people, for communities to be able to move, to freely move in space. And under international law, the sovereign state is the only agent of kinopolitical power, the only subject of kinetic agency. They decide who can move, who cannot move. And in my field, in international law of the sea, by way of borders, the state decides movement in the world's ocean. And we notice that these borders become really agile when it comes to certain mobilities of the state itself or of capital flow, maritime interest in the sea, while for other subjects such as Arctic indigenous peoples, these borders are not that agile. And that can go that as far in my case study to talk about necropolitics, because it seems that beyond kinopolitics, as it seems that this community's culture is currently at risk, basically because they are confined in a certain territory and they cannot practice any longer their traditional way of being in space and hunting marine mammals. Thank you.
Hi, very happy to be here. Today I will raise a few points on my PhD research in relation to today's topic of planetary thought. The working title of my research is Universal Politics of Imagination, Cage of Reality in a Kingdom of Freedom. I'm interested in how we think and what the political implications of these processes are. A new image of thought, as Achille calls for, not only means a new paradigm or solution of sustainable futures, but also places the focus on our methodologies and procedures of thought itself. My research addresses this problematic through an affirmative theory of imagination of universal political thought with post-colonial thinkers and continental philosophy. I study a paradigm beyond biopolitics of Western onto-epistemic of universalism and rationalism towards affirmative ontological freedom and imagination. The aim is to construe an additional paradigm of freedom or autonomy of imagination, or to be implemented within the paradigm of liberalism of reason. My study focuses on political imagination as an ontological condition of universal freedom, as well as an actualization of plural political activity. The research is situated against global erosion of political imagination. This can be seen within trends globally: erosion of politics and democracy, homogenization of knowledge and thought, depoliticization of imagination, as well as identity and post-truth politics. This homogenization of knowledge and expression is related to a condition which Achille has called dark enlightenment, in which reason has seemingly reached its limits. In a time of polarization, conflict, and nationalist policies call for alternative ways of critical thought of the immediate present in relation to planetary challenges of the future, where we are creators of meaning. Political imaginations as becomings in Africa have been discussed by theorists such as Achille and Diani. Achille emphasizes reimaginations of substantive democratic thought through self-assertion in his book Earthly Community, the possibility of becoming creators of meaning. Diani similarly calls for production of new thought rather than identities based on negation and lack. Quote from Diani: "African thought has passed from yesterday's thinking of identity, which was part of the struggle against colonialism, to today's thinking of becomings." In my research, I ask, what is freedom and imagination in a world of apparatuses? How can we conceptualize imagination beyond a vacuum of power as negation towards affirmative and immediate air pockets of freedom? And lastly, how can we think of political ontologies beyond identity? Imagination has long been considered as a creative faculty of the subject, but has been subordinated to reason ever since the Enlightenment in Western thought. In Western political studies, imagination can be seen as an individual capacity, or societies themselves being imaginary, or the very foundation of politics and societies being imaginal, without being tied to assumptions of specific realities. Liberal freedom has been defined either as negative or positive in relation to governance. Deleuzian ontology of freedom actualized by imagination is immediate affirmation of existence as potentiality of practice, beyond negative or governmental liberal approaches or reduction to any social or political order. Conceptual or aesthetic thought on freedom and imagination offers a window to the process of thought in relation to creativity, truth, and identity, as well as political change and power. This approach includes an investigation of post-phenomenological ontology of Deleuze of imagination as open-ended politics. This includes the ontological foundation of the virtual and the creative act of affirmative imagination of actualization as potential. In the context of planetary politics, imagination seen as an ontological register is nothing short of a universal gesture. In this sense, imagination is part of becoming politics, of a singular plural of difference of a community or subject that exceeds the particular universal distinction. This includes an ontological condition of excess of potential that is universal beyond the Western universalism and rationalism. This engagement investigates image and time critically by using Deleuze's concept of the virtual and image of thought, which comprise the political gesture where imagination is disrupting common sense. Imagination can be considered as reason's other, in which case becoming imagination or imagination for itself enables the potential for being otherwise outside the dogmatic image. Through primacy of imagination as difference and beyond experience produces a paradigm of performative nature of thought, existence, and creation from the outside of the self. Thank you.
Thank you very much for what is a truly rich landscape, intellectual landscape that you have painted in 25 minutes. And I mean, I cannot pretend that I recognize myself in everything that you said, but I have to say that whatever you have put on the table did resonate with me very, very deeply, and with some of my own work, beginning with you when you posit the body as the starting point of if not of any interrogation, in any case as the starting point of your own practice and your own intellectual investigation. I mean, you started quite directly with that reference to your body, which of course sent me back immediately to the very last sentence of Fanon's work. Oh, my body, that a prayer to the body, always make of me one who interrogates. This connection, therefore, between the call to the invocation of one's body and the entry into a space of endless interrogation, both of the self and of the world, is something I think I responded to very well. So if I understand kind of experiment you are thinking about, is about writing your body, bodyography, as opposed to biography. That you write the body, but writing the body is here taken as writing life itself, writing, as you put it, identity and belonging, writing what you called alienation, calling, let's see, calling into question alienation, and opening up a space for resistance. And you mentioned in particular this specific moment, I guess you were yourself involved in when you were at Rhodes. Rhodes must fall, fees must fall, etc., etc. So maybe what I can invite you to do is maybe to share with us a bit more of your own thoughts on on why is it that the body, you put it at the beginning and let's say of the project you are trying to undertake. Why does it take that form? Why is it so central? And how concretely will you go about, let's say, writing the empirical piece of work a dissertation is all about? So then I think I'm taking my directions from beyond. No directions. Okay. So maybe we will listen to you, and then I'll go step by step and respond to what I have heard. Okay. A few minutes.
Okay. Thank you.
You don't need
Okay.
this.
Thank you so much for the re-articulation of how I presented my, my research and my practice. And so, if I've understood correctly, why it is I've placed the body at the center of this project. And from the top of my head, I would say that I would quote you in your writing of the critique of Black reason and this codified madness that you had written about, and trying to unpack what it is, and also recognizing that I myself have been participating or have been implicated in this codified madness that is very much related to the way in which the classification of Blackness and race has othered the body that I inhabit, and that even though it is not a classification that I have participated in, again, I am implicated in the very real consequences and the legacies that it continues to enact in society today. So I would say that my behaviors, my understanding of the world and the way that I've been able to navigate within it have very much been regulated by how my body has been defined and articulated towards me, both implicitly and explicitly. And Marta, I think you spoke about how, or was it Marta or Eva? Please correct me. You spoke about how African thinking is now trying to think of futures. So my goal with this research is to unpack this madness and think about a future where the specificity of my experience goes beyond what I have been implicated in.
Thanks so much. In the conversation, it's interesting that you brought in what you heard from Marta. I'm sure you can definitely refer to each other's contributions. Then Signe, I was really interested in this project of yours. You started with the question of laughter. I mean, we laugh a lot in Africa, especially in West Africa. There are many different regimes of laughter. I mean, I've been living in South Africa. They don't laugh there the way we laugh in West Africa. That has always, it's something, I never really shared it with anybody. Yes, I'm sharing it with you today. But when I have been living in South Africa for 23 years. When I first moved there, I was struck by the fact that they didn't laugh like us in West Africa. Because in West Africa, when you really laugh, I mean, you laugh with the whole of your body. And here we go again with the body. The body becomes really it's like an earthquake. The body has to behave in an earthquake-like manner, which means you laugh with your senses. It's visceral. It has to resonate. It has to vibrate. I mean, Atto was referring yesterday to Amos Tutuola's book. Laughter is very present in that book, and it's a kind of laughter that is not necessarily, let's say, choreographed, like in stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedy, I mean, you have a time, you have a space, first of all, and then they tell you come at such and such a time, and then they perform. Laughter in the setting I'm referring to is something that doesn't come naturally. It comes is the result of the encounter of speech. It's something that is commonly shared. It creates spaces of conviviality. It also creates occasions for kind of release, where tension is released. It's cathartic and therapeutic in that sense. I mean, people laugh at almost everything. Everything is this. Nothing escapes that domain. Tragedies, terrible stories people are going through, but also, I mean, dreams. It's a dreams. All the dreams people are harboring, they come and are expressed through laughter. So it's a total social phenomenon, to speak like anthropologists. For that matter, I think it's most. So I would like you maybe to tell us a bit more about that phenomenology of laughter. How do you envisage it? How does it appear in those stand-up comedies you have made your main line of inquiry? What can you tell us something more about? I mean, that phenomenological dimension of laughter and the role it plays in a society like Denmark.
Thank you so much for your elaborate question and interrogation. I think trailing back to the idea of culture as something that is always exclusionary. In Danish culture, comedy studies are very preoccupied with Freudianism, Lacanianism, and the idea of the desire and even what is it called? When you are castration. Yes, castration. And I think that in terms of the type of comedy that I look into, queer comedy and racialized comedy, these ways of viewing the body are very centered around white Western experience, a quite able body, and the way I view the effects of humor in communities of activists that are disabled or LGBTQIA individuals or Black indigenous people of color. In Denmark, it is another type of community, and we need a new framework to inquire about humor in that. And for me personally, I have always been very explosive in my laughter, not really being able to take part in the Nordic, settled, very straight way of, meeting the humor with grace and saying, that is really funny, you know? When
See the way, I mean, I hear people laughing. Are they laughing in a restrained manner or in an explosive? They are not Danish. You understand they are not Danish.
And I think every Danish person will agree with me that we have some type of straight mask. And I took out a part of my presentation about what you refer to with the Dogon people and how the mask is the first commemoration of the dead. And I think in a way, death and comedy are really, really similar because of the Fanonian sense of violence as both medicine and a weapon. And I think that's what we need to talk about in terms of Danish comedy, because we've had the Muhammad drawings and a lot of satirical research, but we are yet to find the commonality between African American stand-up comedy traditions, blackness research, intersectionality, and humor. Because what is it about humor that can exclude and narrow in the domains of what communities we can aspire to make?
Yes, I mean, as I told you, laughing is part of our deep experience, and I agree with the connection you make between the act of humor or laughter, because humor is a bit laughter is, I mean, it's bodily, it's visceral. I prefer that. Laughing and masking, and masks are thrown down, but I also appreciate the connection you make between, of course, laughter and all that relates to the kinds of killing projects that have been so part of our modern history, that you mobilize, you weaponize laughter, and you use it against those you would like to exclude from that domain of the communal, of the incommon, to put it in that way. And it strikes me the extent to which, in fact, you mentioned the Dogon. Among the Dogon in Mali, at least if we were to believe the work done by here historians and anthropologists, have in mind Marcel Griol in particular, the extent to which laughing together, laughing in common, is like breathing in common. That connection, laughter and breathing, it's a space of reconciliation. Conciliation, coming together of the entirety of the sensorium of which we and our bodies are part of. But then, Marta, I was quite intrigued by what you started with. I mean, you started with reference to a funeral procession. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Because I'm not sure that I got it right, but it's something I would like to explore maybe a bit more with you. Why did you bring it right at the beginning of start of your intervention? What was it about?
So it was about reading the sort of concluding remarks of brutalism.
Oh yes, there were we talk about. I mean, yeah.
There's a
I see.
funeral, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I see now.
Yeah.
But why were you struck by that conclusion? Because indeed, it refers to maybe not a funeral procession, but something not far from that. Yes.
Yeah. I think I read that, and then my mind kind of spun on the funeral idea and
Yes.
being in this post-historical moment
Yes.
of the cult of the self and the objects that we are imbuing with so much of ourselves, and then not really knowing, not really being aware that the time for change is almost past.
Yes.
Not being aware that we are in a state of mourning or decline or something to that effect. And I just really like that idea of being part of the end, but not really knowing it or not really recognizing it, and so missing the opportunity for meaningful change. Yeah. So I thought it's a good place to start, because it kind of skips ahead a lot of the chapters that are usually gone through before we end with the funeral.
Yes, it's the chapter on objects.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess I've written a paper on eschatology and the idea of sin and climate change, and that we are in these end times, and we've brought it upon ourselves through humanity's actions in the broadest sense. But then again, it's always been end times, or it's been end times for a lot of people in a lot of places that they thought this is the end. So perhaps that is also happening now. And I didn't quite get to it, but I'm not sure that this is necessarily the end, but more of a rebirth moment where we can think of new ways of arranging ourselves that aren't really imaginable to us yet. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's very, very interesting. And then how do you relate it then to your interest in science fiction?
Yeah, so science fiction
and indigenous forms of futurism.
Yeah. Well, there is this notion of the apocalypse that is one of the tropes of science fiction. And like I mentioned, there's in indigenous futurism this idea of everything being already post-apocalyptical, which allows one some more play with the idea of linearity and temporalities. What are they really when the end is already in the past?
Yeah.
But this trope of the apocalypse is interesting to me, because in mainstream pop culture, a lot of the post-apocalyptical portrayals are similar to many African realities today. So there is a literature saying that science fiction, as it comes through Hollywood, is not something that connects with African realities. But that's also this Kodwe Eshun has written about counter-futures and writing, from perspectives that there's also a lot of power in writing one's own future.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then, I mean, in the Afro-diasporic tradition, of course, you do have text, but the sonic is also extremely central to those. Does it have a place or role to play in your project or not? Are you interested in those musical?
In sound.
Yes.
A little bit.
Because you mentioned Kodu. I mean, Kodu huge part of his work is really reactivation of the sonic.
Yeah. I have touched on it, but I'm not. It's not my central focus. Also because there's a lot of work being
done in that
yeah,
area.
done
Yes,
on Afrofuturism and what's going on in the Caribbean with the sonic and sonic ontology.
Yes, yeah.
Fantastic work. So my project was centered on finding people who are based on the continent still.
Yes. I was going to ask, I mean, what if let's say, very schematically, then we say the Caribbean, the sonic ontology is absolutely central to their work, and it is. I mean, I was listening to Cornel West's lectures given recently in Edinburgh, where he was reinterpreting philosophy on the basis of jazz. He calls it jazz-soaked philosophy. I mean, reading Socrates, Plato, the long Western tradition from the perspective of jazz and blues. What would you say then, I mean, is the signature contribution from the continent? If jazz and blues and music is that of the diaspora?
Of all cultural expression?
I mean, or some of them. From the text you have been reading. What do you see as the key trope of kind of a futurism? Or,
African futurism?
Yes.
Yeah. I guess hope and this radical sort of optimism, kind of relating to what you were just talking about laughter and what it means, is a theme that goes through. I'm mainly reading written texts and some art projects and a utopic impulse. But I'll have to think some more about that.
Yes, yeah.
And we can think together. Yeah.
But what else would you like to add before we move to Apostolos about your project? What else do you want us to?
Well, I want to hear a little bit more about the funeral idea that you presented in your writing later, and if I've misunderstood it or if I've kind of gone on my own thought process.
You see, look, I mean, I don't know, maybe we can talk about it later, but you see, you write and then you move on, and then you come here and then you mention it, and then I go back to the text. Now, but why did I write it? I knew it was somewhere there, but in what state was I when I wrote it? That's the question I should be asking. If I commune to the spirit you have been invoking this morning, the spirit of the body, and what exceeds it. So I see the connection between the objects, the chapter that comes just before that, and I see the connection in the sense that maybe that chapter ends with questions of reparation, questions of restitution, and of universal justice in the face of sovereign forces which are fundamentally necropolitical. I guess that's why it was written in that manner, beyond reason, because it's really not a reasonable conclusion. I mean, the writing is not rational. It's not at all. Which leads us then to the last two presentations, the one on sovereignty, on the law of the sea. See, Apostolos, while you were speaking, I kept thinking about, I was very interested, of course, what you have to say. I kept thinking about work done this time not by lawyers, but geographers in the Sahel, in this huge region of the Sahel, Sahara, in Africa. And the argument they make, which is that, in fact, sovereignty in this huge space, which is bigger than Western Europe combined, which is like a sea too, without being a sea. And Sahara, the desert, is like a sea with the two shores, the Mediterranean and then the Sahelian. The idea that sovereignty historically in this huge space was less about the control of space, which means the erecting of borders, the monopoly of the control of borders, and that it had to do with the control of movement, that motion precedes space. Sovereignty is premised on, let's say, a certain kind of understanding of motion as opposed to space. And listening to you, I kept going back to that work of, in particular, Denis Retailleau, a geographer, who has written a lot on this. And I would like you maybe to tell us just a little bit more on this idea of motion as is manifested in the practices of the communities you were talking about, practice of hunting, fishing, and so forth and so on. In what sense is it so different from the Western concepts of motions, the genealogy of which you went through very briefly?
No, thanks for the insights and the suggestion to look at Denis Retailleau. You said
Retailleau, yes, I can give you the.
I'm not familiar with your work.
I will give you the.
Yeah, first of all, the argument that sovereignty comes to the lineate space and, in a way, reduce mobilities is also relevant to the land, right? And Sahara can be also seen as a sea, as a semi-enclosed sea, where different nomadic groups have been moving in through time immemorial, and then the designation of sovereign states has to a great extent reduced the traditional manifestation of being mobile in space and pursuing traditional activities. And this is the case with pastoralist and nomadic groups elsewhere in the world. But I think in the sea, this is even more pertinent because the sea always defined the outer border of the sovereign, even if the sea has nowadays been territorialized, with sovereignty projecting seawards and enclosing space and so on, a big, quite a sort of social rather than the asocial era without character, as Carl Smith once wrote about the ocean. I was
going to mention him, yes.
Yes. So for the communities I have been looking on, and that's basically why I chose this as a case study for my dissertation. We're talking about the proximity between Greenland and Canada of 20 kilometers to cross from one side of the Polonia to each other. And for the vast part of the year, we're talking about 10 months, this has been always frozen. So these communities, since always they have been nomadic or semi-nomadic, spending the winter season usually in camps, and nowadays, when the weather allowed, crossing the maritime space from Greenland to Canada and moving all around in response to walrus, narwhal, polar bear, and other caribou and other movements in the sea. So they have been really entangled in the way the animals spread in the sea space, and they have been respectively adopting their own way of life. So since the 70s and the establishment of the delimitation zones between Greenland and in respect to the Kingdom of Denmark and Canada, and even more recently since the early 20s and the September 11 attack that increased the overall securitization of the American continent, their mobility has been largely controlled, because until that point, even if it was not allowed on the grounds of bilateral agreements to pursue cross-border mobilities, the communities still, in practice of customary law, they were fluidly spreading in the seascape. And since then, the state has really imposed sedentarization policy, trying to build institutions, keep them in one place, and align their very way of living within certain maritime determined territory. So when I was engaging there with discussions and with participation actually in the field with people hunting, they were explaining nomadism as being the very essence of their own culture, and that they do not really define movement as such individualistically, but they in a monolithic way, as we do think in the Western sense, but they rather endorse a holistic metaphysics, that we move along with the non-humans, along with our spiritual landscape, along with the weather. And now, along with state intervention, securitization policies, they are also confronted with climate change. So both these two elements are really coming to bring an end to what movement meant to them from time immemorial. And while I was there, I saw that the sea ice, for example, was not solid enough for them to ski through, and was not also melted enough to navigate through. So it's this liminal condition that determined the very exercise of traditional activities. And then you could see that for the state, the sea ice is merely a barrier, because they just navigate with icebreakers through that ice, they cut through the materiality of the ice, and in order to secure the mobility of the state and the capital flow within the sea.
Sounds absolutely fascinating. And I mean, as you're speaking, I keep indeed going back to those other spaces which are being restructured more or less along similar vectors. Desertic spaces, pastoralist communities, all these collectives that are on the move, but along separate logics as those that are governing logistics, for instance. Is speed something you have been thinking about in this reconceptualization of sovereignty? You talk about motion, speed, yes.
So speed is not directly within the scope of my research, but of course I've encountered several pieces dealing with speed, and I can see that while in the Kenocene this speed of mobility is booming in light of technological advancements, globalization, media, ongoing changes, and the environmental crisis, and so on. In my case study, I can see that this triumph of speed in maritime navigation is still confronted with this materiality of the ice, of the ice cape, and this friction between the nomadic activities and the state that comes to reduce the speed. So sovereignty takes place in a way slower than elsewhere, when there are this friction between nomadic forces, whether human or immaterial, or more than human in my context. And I guess this is the case in other spaces where there is both encounters with between the state or the corporate actor, because these two, in my opinion, operate as one, and then these nomadic forces, whether you look at the Sahara Desert or in the high Arctic. But speed is something, incrementally coming in our lives, and
fantastic.
Can lead to these eternal frictions.
Okay. Look, we will have time to go a bit deeper into all of this. Just another author who, his name is Eyal Weizman, but I'll give you the references later on. Okay, now Eva, we end where we needed to end, with imagination, which you you related very closely to freedom, somewhere in your presentation. And of course, you incidentally referred to the classical opposition we used to make between reason on the one hand and imagination on the other. I don't know whether you believed in that opposition or whether what you want to do was to interrogate it and look into the possible complementarities between these two faculties. But you might tell us more about that. But you also, if I followed you well, let's say, suggested somewhere that imagination was not just a faculty, it was also a practice. So far so that the practice of imagination might be maybe the first step in the cultivation of a practice of freedom. So can you clarify, at least for me, that apparent conundrum? It might not really be. To what extent is it that the practice of imagination might prefigure or be a manifestation of a practice of freedom? That is not just something theoretical, it's something that is part and parcel of the way in which we experience life.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the comments. Well, essentially, I have always been very interested in imagination, as well as freedom. Maybe has been the most important value, I think, at least politically, and maybe personally as well. And I've always felt like there are many exercises of freedom that you can approach it with. So not necessarily only through these classic ideas of negative or positive freedom, because then it's always kind of dependent upon these specific governance practices. So when I started the project, I kind of just fully leaned into my interest in imagination and maybe took it seriously for the first time, that you can actually analyze it. You can perhaps theorize imagination, and in different ways. So essentially, I was interested in, well, Deleuze, for example, because I think he's a very poetic thinker that could be interpreted in infinite ways. So this is my kind of maybe free interpretation of his ontology. So I don't only see imagination as a faculty, as a phenomenological faculty, that here I am now imagining alternative futures, but rather referring to, well, as I mentioned, the becomings politics, that the main difference then is if we talk about representational or beyond representational imaginations and how we perceive images in our lives, and politically, more importantly, what politicizes imagination. So am I now, when I'm imagining, let's say, a utopia, is that imagination in operation, or is it perhaps that you become that? If I imagine a horse in my mind, is an image of a horse in my mind, or am I becoming the horse? So for me, it fully resonates with me, these maybe a bit wild ideas of imagination having a life of its own, images having a life of their own through joint becomings, joint practices. So for example, Deleuze uses in his it's one of his essays on T.E. Lawrence's during the Arab revolt of these joint becomings with the soldiers, and I think it's a very, very good example of this third perspective of imagination. So here, if we look at how, in my interpretation of how imagination as practice could be seen as freedom, it's sort of a freedom beyond identity as well. So then it is outside of yourself through dissonance. So it is not And that is operated also through time. So this here we can apply this Bergsonian idea of time coexisting with the past, present, and future. And for us to have a rebirth, for example, or actualize these new images, we must clear the old images. We have to split from the past and the present. So these kind of what Deleuze calls zone of indiscernibility, where movement no longer is subordinated to time. Or time, sorry, the other way around. So then that creates this dwelling space of possibility, of potential. So I don't claim that imagination magically would, let's say, end poverty or something, but freedom, I think, essentially, that could be accessible for us all universally within the virtual realm, which is not some parallel reality we can also step into and have these new ideas, of course, but it's constantly here grasped by difference. So how do we then understand the virtual and actual as constantly coexisting? So this very actualization is perhaps the first kind of performative act, but then, of course, becomes the question of how do we continue those, let's say, political movements of new ideas? Are they being captured? So then I believe that things also have an end, in a sense, so it's action upon action. So I think, to answer your question on the practice, I don't see it only as a pedagogical practice, that now we teach how to imagine, but rather it's constantly here. So that is my main, maybe, argument, is that it is indeed has its own life, life force, vitality.
Okay. Well, I mean, you refer to Deleuze, and you're absolutely right. Are there other key authors you bring into this conversation? And who are they?
Well, Foucault, for one, and then the post-colonial thinkers. Well, I use your thought as well, and Diani that I mentioned. Literatures as well. So Amos Tutuola is I'm familiar with, but equally I'm interested in also kind of the theory making there. That it's simply it's not like a Deleuzian kind of hermeneutic study. It's rather just an experimental thought experiment of what a theory of imagination could be, and a political imagination. Yes. Because I don't believe imagination creates anything on its own necessarily in the real world. So what politicizes imagination?
Yes.
But if you have any suggestions of other authors that I'm not aware of, there's Agamben as well, who's a big interpreter of Deleuze.
I think that Deleuze is a very, very interesting starting point, because he's at the intersection of, at least speaking from within the French tradition, intersection of the work done by his Bergson, Sartre, even Foucault. Yeah. Foucault, in his study of Binswanger, he's at the intersection of all of that tradition and all that has to do precisely with the emergence of new media, new forms of mediation, the digital, the virtual, etc. So I don't have any suggestion to make. I think you're on the right track.
Yeah, for me, it's I think his oeuvre is so large already that I think it can be. For me, it's just like Bergson, for example, that has been used to quite a lot of post-colonial thought in his conception of time. Especially so, and there how Deleuze interprets him as well. Yes, so then this non-linearity as well is a big part of my theory making as well. Yeah.
Okay, look, fantastic. It was a total pleasure for me to interact with you, and I really hope it's just the beginning, that we will keep in touch. I'm interested in every one of your projects, and I wish you the best for what comes next. So I will now call upon Bjorn to take over. My task is finished. I would like you to applaud the...
So thank you very, very much. We promised that we would have the possibility of the audience here with us in the University Aula to be able to pose questions to these 5 fantastic masterclass participants, and also perhaps Achille. I've heard, you know, all the classic themes in the social sciences and the humanities, perhaps also law, not so much theology. Exercised here today, we've heard thoughts about the body and the struggle to uncodify the madness, if you will, of the body, and the kind of sedimentation and the unsedimentation that one strives for. I've heard thoughts about the relation between power, aesthetics, the struggle for the in-common, and also, again, then a kind of the attempt towards achieving a type of archive that is not violent and exclusionary. So body, power. I've heard about temporality from Marta, you know, both in terms of linear time, but also the fantastic possibility of thinking recursive time, multiple temporalities, the possibilities to rebirth at end times. So body, power, temporality. I've heard about mobility and movement and sovereignty, and about other ways of being in the world that is irreducible to capital and state. Both, you could say, are versions of necropolitics that Achille have talked about, so body, power, mobility. And I've heard about becoming, separation, about the fantastic possibilities that lie in imagination, not just as a thought experiment, as Eva talked about, but also as a possibility for transmogrification, yeah, becoming other, you know. So fantastic classical themes brought up by these 5 excellent PhD students, and we now open the floor for questions, and I saw Nasreen had one. Please, first.
So thanks so much for all these presentations, super interesting. And I've got a question, it comes from the Deleuze thing, but I'd be interested to hear what everyone thinks about it. This movement from being to becoming, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you think the implications of that is. So what is the real implication if I say, I imagine becoming a horse versus, or I am in a becoming. I'm the becoming horse or the becoming orchid, or, you know. What do you think the implications for identity, for politics are there? And also, what's the risk in some of this Deleuzian thinking? What do we lose? Because I do think, that there might be some language we lose when we move from being to becoming, but I'd be interested to hear what everyone else thinks. And then also the question, you mentioned the question of the universal. There's also a critique of the universal in Deleuze, in the sense that, I mean, the Oedipus complex and his resistance to Freud, isn't the resistance to Freud precisely because he thinks there's a universal there that doesn't allow difference in? He's always saying about Freud doesn't listen. You know, if you actually listen to his patients, what would he hear? So then there is actually what sometimes, you know, with Deleuze, like, there's also a history there, which sometimes in the French tradition, the Western French tradition, it's like it disappears, you know, so, you know, does that speak to maybe some of the limitations of this form of thinking? So I'd just be interested, and in general, what people think about the idea of becoming. Is it a compelling idea, is it exciting, or does it just seem like the old French secularism, laïcité, coming back? I don't know.
Thank you very much. Eva, would you like to respond?
Sure. Yeah, these are definitely the things I constantly think about. I think there's a lot of critique, and I don't intend to kind of romanticize Deleuze, nor becoming a Deleuzian kind of. I'm more interested in kind of freely choosing my own interpretation of of his world, because there's a lot of secondary, of course, research on him, but I may not agree with all of them. Let's say with the universality, I just kind of think that he aims to, he's a pretty normative thinker, actually, that he doesn't necessarily think that the world actually operates this way. I think he mostly just privileges the creation of the new and the potentiality. So that's what I aim to do in the sense that, but not take it as in like literally necessarily that okay, there is definitely, of course, the risk that we need to be aware of if I aim to claim that the universal idea of freedom and imagination, but I don't claim that it's foundational in the sense that there is nothing there that exists in that realm. It does need to be actualized. So in terms of the kind of political nature of the becoming, yes, I think I also just have a personal interest in the kind of reaching beyond the representational and through experience as well. So if we think about, let's say, actors, performance arts, how it is a very different experience of let's say, an autobiography that you talk about your personal experiences, but that estrangement, that dissonance for you to act something else outside of yourself is crucial for the spectator or the reader to make it their own. So they deterritorialize the very experience and they make it their own by reterritorializing it. So I think there's a big difference in kind of like these multiplicities that he talks about, that they are not, they do need to be separate but connected. So this is something that as the procedures of different things, let's say politics or arts, they are separate for a reason, but they're also connected in several ways. So if we say that imagination is political, I think there are many ways to approach that. But for me, it's mostly about what politicizes it is that it becomes actualized. It is something. Yes.
Great. Deleuze is, of course, a plural empiricist. So, I mean, there are lots of non-universal possibilities within his thought, I think. But do you want to respond to any of this, Signe?
Yes, thank you so much for the question, and thank you so much for yesterday's talk as well, very invigorating. I'm thinking about what the countersides to using Deleuze is when talking about imagination, and I think in terms of thinking with it within temporality and plurality of the self. There's something about the relationality, as you talk about, and the representational side of becoming that will always mirror some type of identificationary relationality, and not maybe necessarily, as you also say, something that produces something that makes something in the world that is planetary, necessarily so. And I can't help but thinking about the idea of death within imagination, and that maybe we need to reach back in time in terms of reaching the potential of thinking with imagination that is not just something to create new worlds and futures, but it's also to reimagine what is not. And to think about the planetary, not only to say what we inhabit here on Earth, but also what was before our becoming, what was before the Big Bang, did time exist, did space exist. I think there's a potentiality in reaching into Afrofuturist thinking, but backwards in time, to think with Deleuze, but also beyond.
Thanks. I mean, there seems to be opening here for also Marta and Maipelo, you know, in terms of acting and the futurist kind of vein. Would you like to comment on any of this, or should we open for more questions, or Marta?
No, I struggle to understand Deleuze, to be honest, and I struggle to I think it's just it messes with my concepts a lot. So But I think Afrofuturism as a reading protocol is very useful. The way Isaiah Lavender, the third, has used it to read old or narratives of enslaved people in the past, and reading those with the Afrofuturist protocol for a sort of hope. And he evokes a lot the idea of blackness, which I think is a little bit problematic, but that's a different issue. But reading what imagination can do is to create these spaces for possibility and sort of break through the constraints that we've made for ourselves. And who's policing imagination, and who decides what can be done. And I think these futurism movements, it's a reason why it's happening now. You know, the Latinx futurism and all that, because we need this space for possibilities, but it's also a power struggle. It's also straight up struggle for what kind of futures we want to build, and who holds definitional power, and what is science, and who defines what science is. But yeah, it's a very interesting landscape. I probably will continue to struggle with Deleuze. So yeah, that's what I have.
Okay, Apostolos.
I can also briefly reflect on my own Deleuzean experience. So after pursuing this historical reading of the development of motion, then I looked at the postmodern, and then the Pandora's box opened. And initially I was building my entire critique of the sovereign state and this territorial application versus motion mainly on the grounds of nomadology, smooth striated spaces. This has informed the work of so many legal geographers as well. But then I thought that instead of playing with this open-ended nature of territorialization, Deleuzean thought, nomadology in general, I thought, why to not look at these tangible experiences, the living practices of indigenous communities, similarly to the African example, I guess, because these recorded stories can communicate something in a much more tangible way that can directly also speak to our main disciplines beyond the realm of theorizing. So, of course, it's rich to try to accommodate all of them, but I'm a bit more empiricist than a theorist, at least in my own way of pursuing research, and I enjoy it a lot more.
So it raises the big issue of sort of theory and research, and what is the empirical in a sense. Yeah. Marpello, do you want to chip in here, or?
Sure, I can say that I have not met Deleuze in my research, and it's also become a choice not to. Yes, but what I can speak to is more so your question about the limitations, and I go back to Eva, where you spoke about imagination and how it plays into becoming in the futures, and you mentioned something about clearing up old images. So I have concerns around that, particularly with what it implies and the risks of that practically, when we're talking about actioning the things that are cultivated in the imagination. And then it leads me to questions about responsibility and accountability, especially if we're talking about like the futures and actioning, and who is accountable and who is responsible for this clearing, and what does then happen to the capacity of then re-engaging with the labor of speaking to and creating the future. So those are my thoughts on the limitations and the risks, and it just also makes me think of probably a reference for you that you may have met is Critical Fabulation, written by Saidiya Hartman, if I am correct?
What was
And
the title, sorry?
Critical fabulation.
Oh.
Yes.
I haven't.
So that's perhaps something that you could look into when, especially, Sina, where you talk about going back in order to look forward. That is a protocol that looks into how that has been done practically and how that is actionable.
Excellent. We have at least one more question here. Please, sorry.
Yeah, Sari Hanafi, American University of Beirut. Thank you so much. And I love this design of Holberg Week and with the students, etc. This is really amazing. To Apostolos, have you thought in a time where territoriality become so regimented on this hyper sovereignty? I mean, now banning migrant refugees from mobility, that sea become a space of relatively of this possibility of transgressing this regime of sovereignty. I'm thinking sea as a regime of resistance, thinking about all these humanitarian actors helping migrants to transgress nation-state rules, thinking about the flotilla to Gaza, for instance, to end the blocus against. All this is a form of resistance. I would like to hear whether this resonates your work, and to sign beyond this labeling wokeism, which often is a right-wing criticized left-wing. I hear from you that we should acknowledge that there is a problem. I label it as a societal intolerance. Now we have a real societal intolerance. And behind this societal intolerance, a serious tension between freedom of expression from one side and the DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in your work, how would you, conceptualize these tensions, and whether it's a real issue or not? For me, it's a real issue of our late modernity.
Thank you for that. Two direct questions, Apostolos and then Signe.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing your thoughts, and I, to a great extent, agree as well. I would first perhaps argue that the sea has been complicit in this endeavor of territorialization across the world, at least has been utilized in a way similar to the land, at least from industrialization onwards, but already since mercant capitalism, since it became the arena for transoceanic slave trade. And in a way, land and sea are not really operating separately today, at least in areas where there is this sovereign control seawards. You see artificial installations on the sea, enclosed ports, increased traffic. I wouldn't see the sea as the realm of resistance. However, it as much as the land can be that realm of resistance as well. And you mentioned examples such as refugees in the sea or humanitarian activists in the sea, places like Gaza receiving assistance from the sea. So the sea can be also the venue for creative imagination and perhaps for the deterritorialization and the resisting against the state way of control. Because it is the dynamic forms of the sea that at the same time can be instrumentalized by those forces that they are directed against the state. And it's always a space of friction, a space of tension, and a space of imagination. I don't know if I really touched upon your reflections, but yeah, I think I very much agree with your points. And there is, in my opinion too, the more deterritorialized an ocean space remains, such potential offers. And if we think about the Arctic, that it's the way of sovereignty established on the Arctic has never been premised on the grounds of permanent occupation as other places. The Arctic is the less populated place in the world, and sovereignty has been somehow ruling the Arctic from distance, right? So in such locations with vast geographic distances, extreme weather conditions, and this materiality of the Arctic Ocean as such, I believe that the Arctic Ocean can be a great example of resisting against the territorialization, at least in a more practical sense than actually drawing lines on that in legal books.
Great. Signe?
Well, thank you so much for your question. It kind of ties into the question to over here, because I recently read an article by Rebecca Schneider configuring Tiffany Lethabo King's idea of shoaling as a practice of making more than human interactions through the idea of enslaved people resisting captivity at Igbo Landing in Georgia. And I think there's something about the movement of waters and the encapsulation of more than human entities that we need to account for in terms of these political striving times we're in. I could never be a politician myself, but I can't be political in my writing and in my art, because there's something about enclosing where you stand as opposed to the relational. And I think in these times of the technological becoming a part of the techno-human bodies, we are becoming capitalized as humans, and the relational is seeping away. So through Facebook post discussions and algorithmic oppositionality, the issue gets amplified. But I think if we return to the relational and to at least the trying to create care for one another and reach the in common with each other, I don't think that we disagree all that much. And I don't think that the dichotomy of freedom of expression and diversity, inclusion policies are actually that separate from each other. I think it is imagined as such, and I think it is becoming that through reiteration, through capitalization of our individual selves.
Excellent, thank you. I mean, I've learned an enormous amount, and I would invite now Achille. I mean, we have like 1 or 2 minutes left, but I mean, what have you learned, Achille, today?
I have learned a lot. I have enjoyed myself a lot. When I say I have enjoyed myself, my mind has been kept alive. First of all, reading about your projects, and more importantly, meeting you personally this morning, and I mean, seeing your faces and listening to your voices, and being a witness to the ways in which you try to ground your research project onto key issues of our times, some of which were summarized by Bjorn, and then others came from the questions you were asked and the way you responded to them. So all of that, it's a lot. I mean, to be the recipient of in one morning. So for that, I'm really grateful. I mean, Deleuze is somebody I treasure a lot. And not that he needs to be defended at all. No, he doesn't. And but I like the way you say, "Oh, you have never met him." And then Martha, in her own way also, not that she dismissed him, but she was trying to say, okay, Deleuze, excellent, but I have other stuff to do. And I could see Eva wondering, but what's going on here? Especially when Apostolos also brought in his little experience of deterritorialization, all of those concepts. I guess there are many ways in which we meet we meet authors, voices, we hear them. Some voices clearly require translation, and I think that Deleuze, we didn't mention his colleague Guattari. Deleuze and Guattari require translation. There is also a way of meeting or hearing those voices which sound really impenetrable and opaque, to use a term Nasrin likes referring to. And therefore, the way in which we cultivate a pedagogy of either hearing or listening becomes really important in the reception of the authors who are unfamiliar to us. But I believe fundamentally that there is in every voice a kernel, un chuchotement, I don't know how, a murmur. Every voice doesn't speak as loudly as some of us. One has to really pay so careful attention to hear a whisper which suddenly sets you in motion and brings you back precisely to the ground where you are standing and helps you to rediscover that very ground. And I think that in the context in which we found ourselves today, in this world of noise, a lot of noise going on around us, that capacity to, at some point, recenter oneself and develop a powerful capacity to listen and to hear, all of that becomes part of the, let's say, the work, intellectual work we have to do. And for all of that, I thank you very, very profoundly. And thanks Bjorn, and thanks the Holberg Committee for this marvelous opportunity.
Thank you, Achille, and thank you so much to the 5 brilliant PhD students who have taken their time to join us here today. I think we have all learned a lot, at least I have, and we have all expanded our thoughts on what planetary thought is, might be, might become, might have been. So I think we have all learned a lot. So thank you, everyone, for making this possible. Now, the program with this masterclass has now ended here. But we have another event, as some of you might know, at 2 o'clock, namely the Holberg lecture given by the 2024 Holberg Prize laureate Achille Mbembe in this aula. So if you've signed up for that, be back then. So thank you, everyone.